Hi, I'm Ryan from RTINGS.com. Today we'll be comparing the performance of the Sony X95J and the X950H. We'll be evaluating both of these on our standardized test bench to see how they compare and which one you should buy. The X95J is the newer 2021 version of the X950H. Is it an improvement? Let's find out. We'll start by comparing the design. The stands of both TVs are very similar. They each have multiple stand positions with narrow options for those with smaller tables or wide options for a bit more support. The inputs of both TVs are located on the left-hand side. The range of ports is the same with 4 HDMI ports, USB ports, and optical or analog connections for an external sound system. They also both support a composite input, which is quite rare for new TVs and can be a good choice for those with older DVD players or retro gaming systems. It does require an adapter though, which needs to be purchased separately. On the newer X95J, 2 of the inputs support the newer HDMI 2.1 standard for higher bandwidth signals, and we'll talk about the impact of this later on in the comparison. The remaining 2 HDMI ports on the X95J and all of the ports on the X950H support the lower bandwidth but very widespread HDMI 2.0 instead. Each of these TVs has a different styled back and include VESA mounting holes if you want to put them on the wall. The X95J has an interesting texture and also includes panels that hide the inputs and guide cables to the stand, which is nice. They have quite a similar thickness and will stick out a bit, but this is pretty typical. The build quality of both TVs is great. The back panel of the newer X95J does feel a bit more solid, but we don't expect people to have issues with either. Now, let's compare them in our tests. A high contrast ratio results in deep dark scenes, which is good if you want to watch movies in a dark room like a home theater environment. Both TVs have VA-type panels, which generally have a high contrast, but they also have extra layers on the screen to improve viewing angles. This results in a lower effective contrast on both models, and the X95J is affected by this more than last year's model, but it's still very good overall. Local dimming is a feature to further improve dark scenes for a better movie watching experience, and while both TVs have this feature, the X95J is definitely the standout. It has the best local dimming we've seen on an LCD TV. It does an excellent job with perceived contrast in real scenes, and even though there is some blooming, the overall experience of this feature is the best we've seen and the least distracting in challenging scenes. The X950H is still good, but if you really care about deep dark scenes, the newer model is better. On the other hand, if you want to use the TV in a bright room, then a high peak brightness is important to overcome glare. The brightness of both TVs is similar. They have a great brightness so they can effectively overcome glare in a bright room. Also important for a bright room is good reflection handling, especially when watching dark scenes where the brightness can't compensate. Take a look at the reflection photos of both TVs. They have some similar effects, but the one that's really better depends on your preferences and room. They each smear reflections horizontally though, which can be distracting if you have light directly on the TV. Overall though, they should each be a great option for a room with lots of light. If you've got a wide seating arrangement or like to watch TV with friends and family, then good viewing angles help to ensure no one's left with washed out colors or crushed details. As mentioned before, each of these TVs has a wide viewing angle layer to improve the performance. It works pretty well, and either is a decent option for wide seating. An overall uniform screen brightness and color is important when watching sports or playing video games to avoid the appearance of clouding known as the dirty screen effect. This does vary between units, but the models we bought are in line with what we expect. The older X950H does have a bit darker corners, but they are still both good options and shouldn't present many issues for sports fans. If you plan to watch newer high dynamic range or HDR content, then vivid colors are important to produce highlights that really pop. Surprisingly though, the newer X95J is actually a step down in performance. It's pretty disappointing for a high-end TV, but it's not actually that noticeable most of the time. This is because it's rare to have really saturated colors, even in HDR content. Bright colors tend to be reserved to make small highlights stand out. If you really like a saturated image though, then the X950H is a bit better. Now, many people are interested in Sony TVs for their renowned processing. Within the same brand though, does this really matter? Well, one area that benefits from better processing is the gradient performance, where good gradient performance results in a smoother display or changing colors. For example, a sunset scene in a movie. Both TVs perform excellently, and there's really not much of a noticeable difference between them despite the different processor marketing. When playing video games, a fast response time is important for the clearest image without distracting blur. Again, these two TVs perform extremely similarly. They both have the potential for some smearing in dark scenes, but overall a great result as you can see in our moving logo photo. A low input lag is also important for a responsive feel when playing video games, and again, these TVs are extremely similar. The very small difference isn't noticeable. The biggest difference here is the X95J support of 4K 120Hz thanks to the HDMI 2.1 ports. This can make it a better option for gaming at high resolutions and refresh rates. Speaking of gaming, The big difference between these two TVs is again related to the newer HDMI 2.1 support on the X95J. This allows it to support higher bandwidth signals from the newer Xbox or PS5. Another significant difference is that while both TVs don't support variable refresh rates for tear-free gaming at the moment, the X95J is advertised to receive a firmware update for future support. Speaking of firmware support, these TVs do run slightly different platforms. The X950H uses Android TV, while the X95J comes with the newer Google TV. It's basically the next version of the same platform and functions very similarly with some cosmetic upgrades. They both work well and support a range of apps like Netflix and YouTube. This does bring us to a more significant point though, which is future software support from the manufacturer. As a newer model, the X95J is likely to be more of a focus from Sony if any issues do come up, or for new features to be added in the future. If you care about future-proofing, this is another point for the X95J. Now lastly for the sound. Both TVs have very similar performance overall. They are pretty good and can be suitable for casual viewing, but definitely a tier below dedicated speaker systems or a soundbar. So this brings us to the main question. Which one should you buy? Well, in many respects, the X95J is basically just a minor refresh of the previous X950H. There are very minor differences in picture quality, but they really trade blows here. There are really two main differences that could be the reason to go for the newer X95J. HDMI 2.1 support if you care about high refresh rate 4K gaming with new consoles, including variable refresh rate support that's announced to come in a firmware update, and in general, the additional future-proofing, especially in software when buying the newer version of the TV. If these are things you care about, then go for the newer X95J, but otherwise, just go for whichever you can find for cheaper.